Yeah, that's your feet goes.
Well, if you dress appropriately.
No, I think
Your station in line,
here she comes.
spreading around half naked with naked feet. Where's Berman? He's in shorts today.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is 4:02 and I'd like to bring a very robust agenda to you at the Kane County Committee of the Whole. It is Tuesday, May 23rd, 2023. And clerk, could you please call the roll?
Allen,
Allen present.
Bates,
Bates here.
Berman,
Herman's here.
Doherty,
Doherty online.
Davis, Ford, Gums,
Here.
Iqbal,
Iqbal online.
Juby,
Here.
Kenyon,
Here in the room.
Caius,
Guy is present.
Leonard, Lewis,
Who's here?
Linder,
Linda present.
Molina,
Lena present.
Ross,
Yeah.
Sanchez, Silva,
Silva's here.
Strathman,
In here.
Surgis, Tarver,
Carver's here.
Happy,
Williams here.
Young,
Young here.
Purog.
I'm here.
You have a quorum in the room.
Thank you. We have a quorum in the room, but I would like to talk about the remote attendance policy. We have Mr. Doherty and Ms. Silva has asked for permission to attend this meeting virtually. Do I have your approval to admit them? Yes. Mr. Iqbal, I will give you a pass this time. What is your reason for not attending? That should be counted.
Madam Chair, thank you for being so generous. I don't need a pass. I got this packet from State Attorney's Office. I'm sure all of you got, and I'm reading it, and I read the one before and now reading it again. So I thought I would rather listen and not vote at all in this matter today.
Okay, well, there won't be obviously this. Thank you for that. So we will mute you, sir. And you can obviously stay on and listen. But we have restrictions because of state law. Before we go forward, I believe everyone has received that packet. It came in through my email at 3:00 this afternoon, slightly after 3. So I have not had time, nor has our staff had time to review this at all. So we will not be able to comment on the state's attorney's review of our proposed financial policy. And we can discuss that later. Most likely it won't be able to be adequately reviewed even by tomorrow with the Finance Committee, because it takes time to be able to do the analysis and be able to get a full understanding. So we'll table that for right now. I appreciate Mr. Franks handing that out to us.
We can't,
And we'll certainly have an opportunity to
we
discuss
can't
it.
table that though.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
theoretically, not discuss it until we are able to have an adequate review of this. Yes, when we need to do the pledge.
Well, if you just asked us to postpone something that came through that's directly related to things that are on the agenda. So if you are postponing the rebuttal to the 2 things on the agenda, then I suggest we also postpone the other 2 things, because this is in direct relation to the 2 things that are on the agenda. And if we are not allowed to talk about this, then I do not feel we should talk about the other 2 things.
Well, the other one was planned, and we have just an explanation. It's just information. And as this is information, so if the board would rather sit and have a half hour, 45 minutes to digest this and then continue that conversation, it came late. It did come late. And this will be reviewed. So yes, I'll look, our parliamentarian.
Well, Madam Chair, I
And
just,
and I'm not disagreeing with Ms. Judy's point.
with Shepro, Specialist Assistant State's Attorney. I mean, with respect to it coming late, I would just note on behalf of the State's Attorney's Office that these were questions that came up at the special meeting of the Finance Committee late last week. We had an intervening weekend and this meeting was scheduled on very short notice after the finance meeting. So I think it is perhaps a little unfair to suggest that somehow the state's attorney is late with a.
Well, I'm not, that's not suggest, I'm not, that is not my intent. I just said it arrived today at 3:00 and we've had not time to review it.
I also, I guess, just further to Ms. Juby's comment, I don't know that this is an agenda item. This is something that has been submitted with respect to an agenda item. And I would presume that any item that is germane to the subject under discussion is appropriate to be mentioned. I mean, I don't think this was something that was calling for a vote,
No.
yay or nay.
Not at
So
all.
I guess I think that it's not really an agenda item independently, so I don't know that it can be removed from the agenda.
Well, if we can make reference to it, and I would like to be able, since we're all gathered here, to have the opportunity to have our finance department explain what the new policy is, because we did not have a chance to talk about that. So I would like to have just a full explanation of what that is. It'll be short, not very long, to give the highlights, and this conversation will then be continued. I think that's more than appropriate. So with that, Mr. Young, could you give the pledge for us, please?
Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America.
And to the republic
for which it stands, one
nation under God,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And just one more comment regarding the flag. I have to say that on Saturday, Mr. Caius and I attended a commemoration of our fallen firefighters in Elgin. It's always a lovely ceremony, but on such a beautiful day, they had this large flag that was flying way above the sky. And it was billowing out in complete majesty. And it really struck me because I was under the shadow of the flag and the metaphor of that and how critically important that is to just a remark of the love of our country and certainly the love of our county. So the flag is was a remarkable sight, absolutely beautiful. I just wanted to share that with you. So the approval of the minutes, please, of April 25th, 2023 and May 18th, 2023.
Point of order, please.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
It was not a meeting, so we cannot get minutes from it. It was
Oh,
Believe, we do have minutes,
we can have a minute.
the meeting.
Yeah, but
18th.
Not a
we
meeting.
can,
I think that although, Shepro,
Yes,
although it was not a meeting, it was noticed as a meeting, and therefore they are, you could call it something else, but there was required to be a
of the gathering.
record made.
not minutes.
Not Under approval of minutes then, and we approve it as the discussion. of-
Approval of reports of the
May
meeting. I believe the minutes of April 25th are
That was-
May,
in order. And with respect to May 18th, I would say they should be characterized as the report of the gathering,
a record of,
record of the
a
gathering.
record of. So I will,
I would suggest two separate motions there.
thank you. So thank you, sir. May I please have a motion, a second, to approve the minutes of April 25th, 2023?
Kenya would ask for unanimous consent for.
Thank you,
approval
sir.
of the minutes.
Thank you, sir. We have a second on that?
Second, Berman,
No second needed for a
Second.
unanimous consent.
And-
Only an objection would be in order.
think so.
Well, if there's no objections, then fine, thank you. And may I have a motion and potential second to approve the notes from the meeting that took place on May 18th? Or
Alan moves.
Berman, second.
meeting is the correct word. Thank you.
Alan,
Alan, I.
yes. Berman, Doherty,
Doherty, yes.
Davis, Ford, Gums,
No.
Iqbal, Juby,
Yeah.
Kenyon,
Yes.
Pius,
Guys, yes.
Leonard, Lewis,
Lewis, yes.
Linder,
Under, yes.
Molina,
Molina, yes.
Roth,
Roth, yes.
Sanchez, Silva,
Silva, yes.
Rathman,
Rathman abstain.
Surgis, Tarver,
Tarver, yes.
Tepe,
Deputy, yes.
Williams,
Yes.
Young,
Young, yes.
Pirog,
Yes.
approved.
Ms. Clerk, may I abstain, please? Please mark me abstain.
Probably paying on the same or more.
Madam Chair,
Yes, sir.
yes, I should have spoken earlier. I think only those members who were actually at the gathering should be recorded as voting on the report of that gathering.
So I know
Perhaps
that.
the roll call could be amended to reflect that.
Well, we have Ms. Strathman abstained, Ms. Bates abstained. Ms. Gums was a no. Was there anybody else who was not here on that day?
I wasn't here on that day, I don't think.
No.
Silva switches to abstain.
Is there anybody else?
Sorry, Davis, just joining. Can you bring me up to speed on?
Monday.
Were you here on May 18th, sir?
For what was the event going on? I don't-
Just saying
Don't know
no,
what
Mark.
the-
We had a party,
No.
luncheon.
No,
luncheon.
Mark.
It's about United
No.
Healthcare.
Oh, all right. No, I was not there.
Lewis was not here either, so abstain.
Williams I wasn't there on May 18th, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, not there.
Can go back and listen to it on Zoom and stuff.
I thought we were just voting on the.
No, we did radio today.
Everybody else needs to fess up.
Be present with no quorum. I'm okay with agreeing with the report.
All right, are we good? Okay.
It was a good one, too.
Okay, very good. Is there any public comment? And I see none online. All right. So the first presentation is going to be about Long Meadow Parkway, and who's going to be introducing this?
Kathy Hopkinson,
Kathy.
KDOT. And with me today is also Kyle Harding from Chapman and Cutler and Dan Forbes from Spear Financial. They'll be joining me in a second. I think we could have our first slide. There. Okay, I'm here today to talk about the opportunity before King County to put funding aside to pay off some of the Long Meadow toll revenue bonds. Putting money aside in such a manner is referred to as defeasance. You'll hear the word defease or defeasance today. It's a fancy way of saying pay off the bonds, put funding aside to pay off the bonds sooner than expected. As part of the state of, if we could go to the next slide. As part of the state of Illinois' 2023 budget, the state put aside $17.5 million in their Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity budget from the Build Illinois Bond Fund for the purpose of reimbursing bridge construction costs in Kane County. The DCEO has provided the county with specific instructions on how we can use this money. And they have told us that it can be used only to reimburse expenses that have been paid and only for the bridge, Long Meadow Bridge. We've submitted the application. The department, KDOT has already submitted the application to the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. And we understand that we may be receiving these $17.5 million within the next month or two. So we had to take a look at when this money does arrive here at the county, how should we handle it? What was the intent of these funds? What are legal considerations that we need to look at to ensure these funds are handled properly? And what are financial concerns associated with receiving this money? The intent of this money is for our Long Meadow Toll Bridge. The legal considerations that we had to look at include, we originally issued a bond back in 2018 to pay for the bridge. There's federal tax laws associated with any bond issuance that we had to take a look at. Financial concerns revolve around also the federal tax laws, because when you receive money and invest it, you can't invest it in such a way that would violate the tax exempt nature of the original bonds. As a result of all of these considerations that we've taken a look at, we have this presentation for you today, which includes our recommended approach for how to treat the receipt of these monies and how to use these monies once we receive them. And we also have an ordinance, which we will be taking tomorrow to the Finance Committee for vote. The ordinance puts in place the official mechanisms that need to be in place so that these monies are handled lawfully. Next slide, please. Just a little background. For those of you who are new, just a little history on the Long Meadow toll revenue bonds. The bonds were issued in 2018. They are tax exempt. The amount of the bonds, the original amount was $27,060,000 up on the slide. The interest, $23 million, for total expenses of $50 million. The bonds originally, when they were issued, were to be paid with toll bridge revenues. We would build the bridge, put in a toll collection facility, collect the revenue, pay expenses to operate the bridge, and then pay the debt service from those toll revenues. We put in a backstop on the bond that should we not collect enough toll money, we would use our own RTA transportation sales tax dollars to pay the debt. As most of you know, the bridge is not yet open. The earliest that the bridge might be open to where we could have a toll in place is May of 2025. So at this point, we have not been able to use any toll collection revenue to pay the debt. A couple other highlights. The principal outstanding on the debt at this point is $26,550,000. The final maturity date is in 2048. The bonds have a call feature, and this is very important to this discussion. The bonds can be called in December 2028, which means we have to continue paying principal and interest up until 2028. After 2028, we can call the bonds and pay only the principal to the bondholders. So we're locked into paying principal and interest up until that date. And the bonds are secured by a trust indenture, and our trustee escrow agent is Zions Bank Corporation. Yes.
Just a little explanation. When it says 23 million in interest, what does that interest come from or go to, or?
It goes to the bondholders, and it would be collected as part of whatever source of revenue that we would be using to pay the debt. So initially, toll revenue collected on the toll bridge, that revenue that we collected would pay principal and interest.
But the principal and the interest are almost the same. That's a lot of interest. Like 100%, 90% interest.
Yeah, I would say that's pretty typical. Probably, you know, at some point, Dan, if he's up here, he could probably speak to the interest rates. But yeah, so the total amount that is due and payable to the bondholders is the $50 million.
Wow.
It's a multi-year fund.
Okay, next slide.
No.
This is just a chart showing the principal and interest that's due from now until December of 2028. So these are still payments, interest payments that have to be made. Next slide. So to touch on the considerations that we had to look at. So there's grant restrictions. The state was very specific when we spoke with them of how this money can be used and what it can be used for. It can only be used for construction costs, for the bridge. They want to reimburse expenses that we've already paid out. So under what that creates is a scenario, because when we originally issued the bond and we received the proceeds from the bond, we used those proceeds to pay for the construction of the bridge. The bridge piece of Long Meadow is already complete. We're still working on roadway east of the bridge. So the bridge, the actual bridge itself is complete. And we used all the proceeds of the bond. So in receiving this grant from the state, essentially we're saying the grant is funding the construction costs. So it creates, under this scenario, something called replacement proceeds, which I learned from our attorney. And with that situation, we now have, in essence, bond proceeds sitting in our bank account all over again. And by law, they can only be used for debt service. We can't use them for any other expenses. We can only use them for debt service on the bonds. And so that is our plan. That is our recommendation, that the county turn over the 17.5 million to the trustee, Zions Bank Corporation, where they will hold the money, invest the money. And there's some restrictions on how they can invest the money, that they invest money and pay bond principal and interest. There's one other scenario where we could say, when we're going to go over both of those slides, where we could say, we give all of the money to the escrow agent, but we also chip in some more money to speed up the payment of the debt. And we're going to present that scenario, but we really recommend against it, not because it doesn't meet the letter of the law, but mainly for financial purposes. Because the original bond was a tax exempt bond, when we turn over the 17.5 million, the escrow agent cannot earn more interest on that 17.5 million than the original interest rates on the bonds. That would violate bond covenants and, in essence, make the tax exempt bonds no longer tax exempt. So the escrow agent has no benefit to not pay down, use that money to pay down the debt. So it makes sense that the county not chip in more money to help pay down the debt, because we can invest the money at higher interest rates. We can take advantage of the current economic climate with higher interest rates. So with that, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Kyle Harding from Chapman and Cutler, who's going to talk a little bit about the mechanics of what has to occur and why we have this ordinance before you today and to the Finance Committee tomorrow.
Thank you, Kathy. Madam Chair, members of the County Board, appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about this defeasance today. I'm Kyle Harding with Chapman and Cutler. We're your bond counsel. We wrote the approving opinion on that 2018 bonds that we're talking about using the grant proceeds to defease today. We also will be special counsel to the county and render opinion in connection with this defeasance. Kathy did a good job of highlighting that there's a little bit of state law with respect to the restriction on the grant, and then there's some federal tax law issues that we're considering. At the time the county did the bond deal in 2018, the county took advantage of tax exemption. So the IRS will allow governmental entities, when they're borrowing for governmental purposes, they'll allow you to borrow on a tax exempt basis, which means those investors that are receiving those interest payments on your bonds don't have to pay federal income tax on that interest. It's excluded from their taxable income. And as a result, they demand a lower coupon from you, less interest from you compared to debt that they would have to pay taxes on. So understandably, the IRS looks at that as a subsidy because you, through issuing tax exempt bonds, are otherwise depriving revenues that would flow to the treasury. And so there's a variety of rules that we need to comply with going forward in order to maintain the tax exemption. And the opinion that we will give in connection with the defeasance escrow that's settled in accordance with the provisions we're talking about today is an opinion that those bonds are still tax exempt, notwithstanding the fact that an escrow has been settled, which is making payments on those bonds. Just also wanted to follow up on Kathy highlighted that from a federal tax perspective, the grant proceeds are considered replacement proceeds. It's very important. And many of you, I recognize your faces, were in the room back in 2018. I know that the grant was not expected to be received at the time the bond deal was done in 2018. The IRS understands that after bonds have been issued, that you may receive funds which can be dedicated to the project for which the tax exempt bonds were issued. However, they treat those as replacement proceeds of the bond issue, and that same restriction applies. So just following up on what Kathy said, the only authority that the county board has with respect to the grant proceeds is to pay down these tax exempt bonds. But although you don't have discretion regarding how to use the funds, as Kathy alluded to, there is some discretion at the county board level about how to structure that escrow. Is the escrow going to be structured so that all of the payments from now until the call date are being made from the escrow and the county needs to use zero of its own other lawfully available funds? Or do you structure the escrow to take out some of the higher coupon bonds, and between now and the call date, then the county would need to contribute some funds to each of those debt service payments? So the slide that's in front of you right now is the recommended approach. There was an earlier slide where Kathy showed the debt service payments from now until the call date. Again, 10-year par call. You cannot take out those bonds that mature after 2028 until we get to 2028. That's very common in the municipal space. It encourages investors, tells them that they're going to get the benefit of their bargain for at least that period of time. So we know that these debt service numbers cannot change even when the county settles this defeasance escrow. But under this approach, if you look to the very last column, you'll see that the escrow can be structured in a way in which the county is not required to make any payments on the bonds from now until the call date. The alternative option, which I briefly mentioned a minute ago, is that the county could also structure or alternatively structure the escrow to take out some of the highest coupon bonds. If the county were to decide on this approach, however, if you look at that very last column, now you can see that the escrow is no longer going to be sufficient to make 100% of the debt service on the payments when they're due. And as a result, every 6 months, the county will need to come out of pocket for some of the interest that's due on the bonds. So most of the debt service would be paid from the escrow, but again, there'd be some that would come from the county. So in comparing those two different approaches, the recommended approach it saves the county roughly $1.5 million of RTA sales taxes. Kathy highlighted an important fact that those funds are not subject to the same investment restrictions that the grant proceeds are subject to, which is that you cannot invest them above the bond yield on the bonds, the 4.17%. But The disadvantage of the recommended approach is that when we finally get to the call date, because you've used some of those grant proceeds to make interest payments along the way, that instead of defeasing, there's roughly $22 million, $23 million of callable bonds. You'll have about $1.5 million less in the escrow to call bonds on that date. So you're using, essentially you're helping from a cash flow perspective, you're preserving your RTA sales tax money along the way. Then when you get to the call date, more of the callable bonds will still be outstanding under the recommended approach. One other thing I wanted to highlight under either approach, and at the beginning of the presentation, we highlighted, you're going to hear the word defeasance a lot. There's a legal significance to settling a defeasance. Under either of these approaches, the county will have realized a defeasance under the trust indenture, which means that effectively, from a legal perspective, those bonds which are being paid from the escrow are no longer outstanding from the county's perspective, that the bondholders would instead look to just to the escrow for payment and not to the county. So that's not a difference between either of the two approaches. Both approaches will accomplish a legal defeasance. All right, so the last thing I wanted to highlight then is next steps for the county.
Could you go back to the one that had all the zeros in it?
Yes.
So in this case, all the money is coming out of the escrow.
Please.
So in this case, all of the money is coming from the escrow account and none is coming out of the general fund or something like that from the, so
That's correct.
is it too soon to say this looks like a better approach? Do we save the money for the
This is the
county?
approach that I'm your attorney, but this is the approach that your county staff is recommending. From a legal perspective, again, both of them satisfy federal and state law requirements. This
Mhm.
approach preserves those other funds that you would otherwise use for debt service. But when you get to the call date, then there'll be slightly less money in the escrow in order to take out some of those callable bonds.
Okay, thank you.
And I should highlight these, and there's a footnote that's written very small on the slide, so I apologize for that, but interest rates change every single day. We are in a interesting high interest rate environment, certainly. This opportunity to settle a defeasance escrow at the arbitrage yield isn't something that we've seen in the municipal space in over 20 years. So you're able to preserve a lot of this $17.5 million because the funds will be invested in treasury obligations that will be right at or slightly under 4.7%, which a few years ago was unheard of, essentially that high. So you're preserving a lot of that, but that is effectively the difference, the cash flow of preserving that RTA sales tax money. So then in terms of next steps for the county, either way, the county board will need to take action to authorize the use of the grant to defease the bonds and to authorize and direct the execution of the escrow agreement. All of that can be accomplished in one ordinance. We've prepared that ordinance. A draft was included in your board packet. And the current plan of finance calls for board consideration of that ordinance, I believe at your regular meeting in June.
All right. Yes, yes,
This
sir.
is Caius. So this is just the $17.5 million that we're starting with, right? And we're expecting another payment. We're just figuring what this is going to do, and then we'll plan later when the other one comes in.
If we have to, fingers crossed, come in.
Yeah.
Right, this plan of action today is just for the 17.5 because we are expecting to actually receive the deposit within the next
Coming
month or
now.
two. Yeah.
And that just gets us to 2028.
Yeah, if we use all of it in this recommended approach, the county won't need to use any of its own monies to pay debt service through 2028.
Are there any other questions on this? All right. Well done, Kyle.
Oh, I do have a question, Madam
Oh,
Chair.
yes, of course.
So we will have an ordinance at the county board meeting?
So are
And
we going to be
which
going?
option would be?
I think we're going to go over the ordinance now. Is that correct? So you can
Well,
explain it.
the ordinance was included in the packet and we are going to have it at the finance committee tomorrow for a vote. You'll notice that the actual document itself does not include any numbers in it. Because as Kyle explained, with interest rates changing, it'll be similar to like a closing. On the day that we receive the money and fund the escrow agent, we will be developing the exact numbers on that date.
Everybody fine? Yeah. We're all in agreement theoretically with this plan of action here. Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, next topic. We're going to be talking briefly about the formal budget policy and what that comparison and contrast is compared to the current budget policy.
No.
Nope.
Already? Yes. Not that I know. You wish.
Yeah, to a vote.
Madam Chair.
Yes, yes.
On the agenda, the next was the ordinance. Are we skipping over that?
Well, that's what I just asked, and I think they just submitted it for your information, not to go over it, because they all left. And it'll be talked about tomorrow.
Thank you.
Good thing I wasn't singing.
Thank you, Mr. Young.
Technology is not one of my favorite skills. I'm great at using programs, but everything else I tend to break. For those members who are not on the Finance and Budget Committee, this is just a brief summary of the formal budget policy that we presented to the Finance Committee. And basically what it does is explain what a true formal budget policy accomplishes. One, it creates a budget that is realistic, measurable, and provides quantifiable goals, and can be used then the budget as a really good tool to gauge performance of how the organization is doing. It also establishes a budget that represents the true need of all the elected and the department heads, while also controlling overinflated budget line items. And last but not least, balancing the budget without use of fund reserves, with the exception of the Division of Transportation, because their projects go out for years and years and years. And some of your grant funded departments really assist in your future financial planning, because once you have to use your reserves just to balance a budget, which is not a recommended practice, you're putting yourself on a rocky road. Just understanding the roles of the budget development. I am a real fan of county board members. Some of you are going to think these slides are kind of corny, but you guys, all board members, I shouldn't say you guys, I apologize for that, have taken on a huge role. And one of your roles that are so important is the development of a budget. And you should be very, very proud of yourselves for putting yourselves in that position to take on those tasks. It's never an easy process. But for the county board, you as a board are responsible for every single dollar that leaves this organization. It doesn't matter whose office, whose department it comes out of. You awarded the money, they've spent the money, you're accountable for how it's been spent. One of the things I would highly encourage with a good formal budget policy, you should start eliminating a ton of budget adjustments during the year. I mean, in the 2 board meetings I've attended, I was shocked at the number of resolutions coming forward asking for an adjustment to your budget. And you're really what, in the second quarter now of your budget year? You shouldn't be seeing a lot of adjustments until the third quarter, when business is starting to ramp down and budgets are getting tight because we've paid for what we've planned on for during the year. But to be adjusting your budget this early in the year was a little surprising to me. And last but not least, from a county board standpoint, communication is a tool that you should all carry in your pocket, because communication is knowledge and knowledge is power. And you should be working with each other because there's strength in knowledge, there's strength in power. And you should be communicating and making sure we all understand the same information that's being presented before us. And none of you are experts, just like Erica and myself, Madam Chairman. You can't be an expert in everything that's coming before you. You just can't. There's a lot of data and a lot of knowledge that you're faced with. So I do have a quote up there that I've always used in my past. Become the kind of leader that people would follow voluntarily, even if you had no title or position. And I think that says a lot about communication. I think that says a lot about each and every one of you. You took on the role, you ran for an office that was challenging. You're held to, I don't know how to put this properly, but a higher level from your constituents, because everybody wants something different. And it's hard. It's hard to pull it all together. And if I were allowed to, I'd be standing here applauding you, but then you'd all send me to a nut house. So that's another story. So be proud of the powerful role you're playing in controlling the spending of tax dollars. Keep up the good work. Be proud of yourselves, but be informed about it. Knowledge is power, and understanding the challenge of each office and department, that is really powerful. And I would encourage all of you to be proactively visiting your departments and your elected offices to gain a better understanding of what they have to go through to provide the services they're providing. And this is my belief and my belief only. The county board has given departments and elected officials a great opportunity by being involved with the budget development. State statute really says it's your role. You could assign anybody you want to create a budget. You don't have to have involvement from any department, but you do allow the involvement. And I think that's really powerful on your part. And I applaud you for that. And last but not least, I think we all forget, and I truly mean that across the board, all of us, budget is not an edict to spend. It should not be looked upon with the old adage of, if I don't spend it, we're going to lose it. We've come too far as a society to hang our hats on that. Budget is meant to be, we ask for what we really need to perform the services we're asked to perform. And if we need something pops up, an emergency situation, that's what the board is here for. That's why you build a reserve, because that reserve allows you to then fund that issue. And so I just really want to applaud you all for taking on this challenge. It's not an easy challenge. And last but not least, and you're all going to laugh at this, but I really do thank you for all becoming board members. Someone had to step up to the plate. You've all done it. I know it's not easy at times. It's not easy being a finance person at times. But you know what? You have to believe in yourself. You have to believe in what you're doing and that you're providing the best services you can as a board member to your constituents. And with that, That's basically my slide presentation. Keeping it at a very high level.
So with that, are there any questions? Yes, Ms. Juby.
So at the special finance meeting last week, we were asked to submit our suggestions, questions, or comments that would allow us to send this resolution forward. What has become of those? Have
Those
those
were,
been compiled? And when will we see them?
they were sent to finance and they can certainly respond now if
We
they'd
have
like that
answered-
status.
We have it here.
Okay, you didn't answer my questions, so it would now be an appropriate time to address the questions that I had that were
Yes.
in my
Absolutely.
my notes.
absolutely.
All right, the first one I have is you're suggesting that we should maintain 6 months of reserve, which I think is a very lofty goal. But I think that that might be construed by our taxpayers as overtaxing them. And considering 2 to 3 months or 25, no more than 25% is generally what most other municipalities do. I would suggest we look at that just so we have more buy-in from our taxpayers who don't feel like we're asking more money than we should. I speak from years of being on the school board where when you have a high reserve, people just make the assumption that you have overtaxed them. And I don't want to relive that experience if possible.
And we did answer that question.
And where was that answered?
It's right up here. We thought we would do it as a presentation, so all the board members who weren't at finance could also hear the response to your question.
So that's not in our packet.
No, because we just finished it. We
So it would be
just
appropriate
finished
for me to ask these questions now if they're still continuing.
Yes, and we can do one at a time, so each one can be answered. If
Okay.
So, please.
So I hear your concern. I understand your concern. I do want to point to the board, and I would recommend you all go out to the GFOA site. They have a paper out there called Rethinking Budgeting. Should we rethink the reserves? And this is
And you
done
can send
by,
us a link to that. That'll be sent via the link to all of our board members, please.
and it's basically from 3 authors. 2 are PhDs from 2 different universities. One's from Western Michigan and one is from Alabama. And then one is a employee of the GFOA. And it's really a great paper to read because it addresses, yes, we need to rethink the reserves so we can respond to the happenings in the world around us today. And one of the first things this paper deals with is to stop thinking of the reserves as a rainy day cash fund, because that's really not what it is. And it starts wanting people and governments to start thinking of it as a risk insurance policy. Because as things are, the higher the risks are in an unknown economy, the more vulnerable a government becomes, and how important the reserves are to be able to offset that. An example is when the state of Illinois didn't approve a budget for almost 2 years, and all that revenue slowed down and we weren't collecting the revenue. A lot of the governments had to pay their bills and work off of what reserves they had in their funds. And it truly, this article, which I would recommend for a good read, addresses those concerns and how important it is that municipalities and local governments, county governments, really start paying attention to reserves and creating a strong reserve policy around their reserves. And so to answer your question a little easier, when we say a 6-month reserve, what we're talking about is 3 months that's truly a reserve for emergencies, strictly emergencies, one-time expenditures. The other 3 months is really a cash flow from December 1st until May 31st, when the biggest part of your revenue, which is the property tax collection, doesn't start being collected until June, and that's when that money comes in. So the money you're receiving from your other taxes, your income tax, your sales tax, even the cannabis tax, isn't enough to fund the operations of this government every single month until that property tax comes in. So that 3-month cash flow prevents you from having to issue TAWs, which is tax anticipation warrants, because those tax anticipation warrants, if you have to issue them to get cash to pay your bills, that reduces the amount of money you're going to have to offer in your budgets. It's going to cut because you're paying interest on them. They're the first thing by law that has to be paid off before you can use any of your tax dollars. And so it's not a great practice you want to get into. And we're working, because I'm so new yet here, helping out until you hire a new person to fill the executive office. I have not had a chance yet to put together solid numbers on where your fund reserves are really standing, especially for your corporate fund, but that is something you'll be seeing and hearing about shortly. You have to also keep in mind your 22 financial audit is not finished yet. Finance is working very, very diligently on getting that done. So even when I come up with that number, there could be slight changes for you. Now, I asked Madam Chairman, and I'll ask this board. I know in the past your fund reserve has been reported in percentages. I would rather do it in months of reserve, because when I present this, I'm also going to present how much it costs per month, and it's an average, what it takes to run this government from your general corporate fund. So to me, once we do that, it will be much easier to know than what months in reserve means versus a percentage of revenues. If that's something that's approved by you as a board.
Ms. Juby, do you have another question?
I'll wait for him to go through the list.
The consumer price index was raised as a question, and Ms. Juby, I don't know who, when the questions were submitted to me, I have to apologize. I don't know who sent them. So if I've missed something, it's not
Oh, I'll
meant
let
on
you know.
purpose,
No, I don't take it personally.
because, and I think it was wisely done that I was not shared with who sent them. That way I can address everybody equally and the same. The consumer price index. This is something that currently has not been in your financial policies. And it's something that I recommend should be in your formal budget policy. What people, consumer price index, you as a board under PTEL, which is the property tax extension limitation law, which is really the property tax cap on the 6-county region around Cook County. You have the right to take up to, you can increase it by what you want as long as you don't increase it by the CPI, or you can increase it up to the CPI. It has to be the smallest though of the CPI, or up to 5%. And in my past experiences, we have found that having that CPI established, whether you're going to take it, whether you're not going to take it, really assist in your budget development. Because if you wait till the end of the year and decide whether you're taking it or not, everything that's been done in the budget, if you decide to take it, has to be readjusted. And there's a short period of time to get that all done. It leaves the window open for errors to occur because everybody's rushing to finish it. If the board makes a true effort to establish whether or not they want to take it up front, then the people who are doing your budget will know how to build your budget. It isn't reversing everything that's been done. And there's a lot of hard work that goes into that budget. And so it's a recommendation. I would highly encourage it be a debate and a focus. If the board decides not to approve it, at least your people going forward know what they're working with. Again, it's your choice.
That was one of my questions. So, so what is, first of all, I want to make sure everyone understands that by taking that vote, you're committing to raising the levy in when we have our budget hearing for that. So what is the plan B if everyone says, oh yeah, plan the budget for the CPI or whatever, and then we get to the time when we're taking our levy vote and the board doesn't pass it. So what's your plan B for that?
Well, hopefully you will know what the levy amount is long before November. I mean, that is something I'm starting to work on now for you. That will be presented. And again, I'm not sure, I'm not correlating the two for concern.
Okay, so when we pass a budget that has increases because we need to fund services, and then we get to the point where people actually have to vote on whether we're going to raise people's property taxes, and they say no, what's the plan B? If we've
It will,
created our budget around what we need, and then we decide we're not going to fund it.
well, hopefully, if you voted on an approved resolution passing it, that takes care of that
There's nothing that
discussion in
guarantees,
November.
there's nothing that guarantees a board member has to make that same vote. I'm just,
And
I-
Mr. Berman may have a comment on.
Madam
on
Chair,
that.
thank you, Berman. You may recall past budgets as we presented, we've had a with or without or with or without budget
right.
being presented. So that is the question we have at that point in time. That's when we make the decision. Okay.
I understand that's when we make the decision, but that doesn't guarantee that we're going to have the same vote when it's time for the levy. And
No,
I
but
just wanted to know
Well,
if we had a backup for what happens if we don't vote, for it.
Well-
This is my first budget. I'm sorry.
oh, I'm sorry.
It's my first budget that I've done
Okay.
with the county board,
All right.
not my first budget that I've ever.
No,
done
no,
for
from the county
municipality.
board standpoint.
Yes.
And would it be possible, and I'm just reflecting on what you're saying, Mr. Lee, is that if this board decides not to vote in favor and decides to lower it or whatever the ultimate decision is, that would be instructed to the finance committee to reduce that budget by that amount.
Yes.
Because if we ensure that we are going to have the reserve fund and the 3-month operating fund, and that was approved, there's only so much money. So if you are going to reduce budget, for example, $2 million, then everything else has got to go down $2 million appropriately.
I understand how it works. I'm just asking, does that give you enough time to change what you've presented if that happens?
Well.
I'm not saying it's going to happen.
And
I'm just
understand.
saying that I don't want anybody to be caught unprepared if it does happen.
I guess we could adjust the budget down by all means, but depending on when it happens, you cannot start a new fiscal year without an approved budget. So it may mean that nobody gets paid the first week of December if there's a payroll because we have no budget approved to pay them. So there's a lot of considerations around that, and I personally can't answer that question
Okay.
for you. It was never an issue in my past where I came from. We had that argument up front, and sometimes it could be a good argument. But everybody, once it was agreed upon, pretty much just stayed the same with it.
Okay, and we can ask for legal opinion. My understanding that a new budget moves things forward with new amounts. If no budget is passed, things are not necessarily frozen. I may be completely wrong, but you continue on with last year's budget.
Oh,
Mm-mm.
No,
It comes to an end.
it comes to an end. So then there is no more resources. All right. What a heck of a thing.
Don't think about it.
What a heck of a thing.
Don't let that happen.
Okay, all right.
The question around the vacant position policy at this time, because it is being challenged and who knows how it's gonna work itself out. There's really nothing I can address on it, and I apologize to you for
It's okay.
that.
I think these are just my questions. Did no one else?
Yes,
submit
there were some
questions?
other comments.
Okay,
There were
good.
other comments.
And then we're gonna jump to the no guaranteed of continued funding levels. I'm not sure if that was your question or someone
that.
else's, but I want to,
not mine.
okay, I want to state that that is in there for many reasons, and I don't list all the reasons, but let's say the country goes into a huge depression next month, the stock market blows up and there's no more funding. Well, you have to be able to reduce budget across the board. You can't just pick and choose. I mean, if no money's coming in, the system is going to fail miserably. And so it's just, it's in there to say there is no guarantee. We don't know what the economy is going to do tomorrow. There can be no promises that the funding levels will stay the same because you don't know what's going to be coming at you in the economy. And that's really all it's meant to say. It's to give you the ability, and even if nothing major happens, the state statute gives you the full authority to create the budget, and nothing in the state statute says it has to be at the same level. And then there was a question on federal and state funded programs. Concern was what happens if in the policy it states if funding should end, then the county board has to make a decision basically around, do we keep that program going? Do we want to fund it with our own money? And that is a choice of the county board. If it's a mandated program, then that limits the choice of the county board because, as you know, we get stuck with a lot of unfunded mandates, and we have to come up with how we're going to fund those mandates. And so the suggestion was that maybe the elected officials would then contact the chairman of the board and say, you know, we've lost this program, come up with a new funding for us. And I can't really respond to that question because that's one of the questions being challenged over the vacant position policy. Elected officials don't want to have to come to the board and tell them. And so I don't know how that's going to pan out in the future. And then there was a question on the allowance for open positions. And this is used by many local governments. When I would attend the GFOA meetings, we would have several conversations around it. And what the allowance for open position does is it says that we're going to take a small percentage and withhold it back on just the regular salaries and the part-time salaries. Because, and especially now in this post-COVID era that we're living in, getting people to come to work and to take a job has been challenging. You just don't hire someone the next day when a position is vacated. And so that means that position could be sitting open for a month. It could be sitting open for 6 months. And that means you're not going to need all the funding for that. So the proposal here is we would take 1% back or 2%, depending on the size of the budget, and put it in a reserve. So it's still going to be part of your budget. It's just not going to be sitting in the personnel budgets that could then be used for other things because you've awarded that budget for a position. And that's all it's doing is protecting some of the funding. It doesn't protect the whole position that was funded, but at least it's it's acknowledging that you do have turnover and that positions do sit vacant.
That just applies to, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, yes, yes.
Sorry, that was my
Fine.
question. So that just applies to the vacant positions, not all the budgeted positions? It's just the positions that are open
Well,
or
we,
all the positions?
we're gonna take 2%. If you have a, let's say your personnel budget for regular salaries and part-time, it does not include overtime, it doesn't include any of the special pays. If we gave you 25 million, because that's what you needed to fund your payrolls for the year, we're gonna withhold 2% of
It's
that.
lump sum regardless of how many positions. Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
And again, if towards the end of the fiscal year, their budgets become depleted, we would start feeding it back.
I understood it. I just didn't know if it was a lump sum or if
Yeah.
it was off of okay. Got it. Thank you.
I'm fine. And basically, that was the questions we received. Are there any other questions that we could address?
Ms. Bates?
My first question is, so I've been on the board 2 years, 2.5 now. So I've been through the budget process once or twice. And I see that this policy would say that no fund reserves will be utilized to balance the budget. In past years, I'm quite sure we did use reserves to balance the budget. And this feels to me like a big change. And I'd just like to know why we're doing this and if this is a good policy for us right now. And maybe there could be some discussion that.
Well, I cannot answer if it's a good policy for you or not for this county, but I know for most counties and for most best practices, you never balance a budget with your savings account for emergencies. I always compare it to myself and being at my, I own a home and I have savings and I work. But if the roof were to need to be replaced, I'm not budgeting that based on what I have in savings. At first, I'm trying to budget, how can I afford to make these payments with my earnings every day or every month? And so it is not a recommended budget practice that you would ever balance your budget with the reserves. Now, it doesn't mean that there won't be times when huge cost can occur. And let's take, for example, when the radio system changed for communications and they put everybody on different bands and they moved your TV. I mean, that was a huge cost to counties because you had to update all your equipment and those radios aren't cheap. That would be the kind of thing that year you might have to use your reserves to balance your budget because you've got this huge cost now that it wasn't a cost you necessarily agreed to accept. It was a cost you were told this is happening. And if you want to use the airwaves, this is what you've got to do. But for most times you would not use a reserve to balance your budget.
I agree with that from a household point of view. And I agree with it on a county point of view. I just wonder, because we don't have the budget complete yet or really hardly started, I wonder if that's going to result in some cuts that might be more severe than necessary if we had the flexibility to take some funds out of the reserves. And I know you don't need to answer that. I will put that to my fellow
But I can
board
answer
members.
that for you. And that is, this is a guideline, okay?
Mhm.
If the county board decided they really needed to use the reserves, by all means, you can take a resolution and say, we're going to override the budget policy. We found that it's necessary to fund these items.
Okay.
But it's a starting point, and that's all it's really meant to be, a guideline for people to
Flexibility.
follow. Yes.
Makes me feel better.
Any of these things can be changed by the county board during the year. It can be tweaked. But again, it's a starting point to start with. And it where it really helps is your departments and your finance team, because when you have no real specific direction on what the county board really is aiming for, it's hard to put together a budget.
Okay.
You're
We
like a
can hope
kid in a
not to use
candy shop,
reserves.
you know? I'm sorry.
We can hope not to need those reserves.
Also, just the past couple of years that we have been using the reserves to balance the budget. Always at the end of that process, it's been the direction from the county board that we really shouldn't be doing this. We need to take a harder look at things. And so that's where this is coming from as a starting point, that we really should not be doing that. And that's
This
the
has
direction
been
we're
your
trying to do.
recommendation. I mean, it truly has. So we're just following that recommendation.
I have another question, please. Under budget submittal, I read, I hope I'm on the right copy.
I'm sure you are.
It's the one from the Special Finance Committee meeting. All departments and elected officials' budgets shall be submitted in accordance with the existing levels of services provided unless funding is identified and available through other revenue sources or a departmental reorganization. So I would like to present to my fellow members that we might have situations where a position might be needed, which could generate revenue, such as in finding funding from new grants or finding savings through new practices. An example would be the new solar panels that are going to save $5 million for the county. So we're thinking that we might need more flexibility in that wording, that unless funding is identified and available through other revenue sources or a departmental reorganization or a position that might generate more funds in itself.
Okay. One thing I wanted to point out too, regarding the budget submittal, basically, we're asking, at the end of since I've been here at least 16 years, at the beginning of every budget process, there's always a guideline that's kind of put out as a suggestion, like this is what everyone needs to do for this budget process. Keep your contractuals flat this year, it's varied over the years. So this is the same idea. We're stating, here's where we should start. And we're asking people not to add anything new into the budget as it is, but you can make it on a form and you can request anything new. That way it's helping the finance department and the county by the additional items that may be needed. It's not that 100% to say that, there's not going to be anything that the board is going to approve that's new. We're not trying to say that at all. It's just the mechanism, but thank you for your suggestion on the wording as well.
Thank you.
We hope with the change in how we're going to approach the budget entry level is that in the past, departments just built into their current budget their new needs and wants, and it took finance forever to have to go in there, pull them out, make sure they were justified, make sure they had supporting documentation for it. What we're trying to do this year is a new concept. It may fail miserably, but if we don't try, we don't know. And this year, what we'll be asking departments to do is enter all your new budget increases. We've created a form that fills in everything for them except the line item code and the dollar amount, but everything else is completely populated for them. This way, when we do revenue projections for your 2024 budget, which will be starting very, very soon, I'm working on it now, by saying we're starting with a no growth budget, we'll be able to see and be able to tell you as board members, okay, we're projecting between the tax levies and all the different taxes you collect and all the different revenues that we're forecasting for. If we take that total and compare it to your approved budget for 2023, that should give us how much money you really have to award and work with before you have to get into spending your reserves. But it gives you, the board, to be aware of that. It gives you, the board, to make the decision if you want to fund it this year, or if it's something that maybe we fund it mid-year, or maybe it can be withheld for a year. You know, is it mandated? Is it a service you have to start right away? What we're trying to do is give the board the ability to make sound financial practices as this budget process is moving along.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Ms. Bates, you have any other questions?
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment. Does anybody else have a question?
I do. This says May board meeting.
Oh, well,
Resolution,
Original.
okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we should have caught that. I apologize.
Scribner's error as we go through this process. All right, is there anything else?
Unless you want us to go through the comparison between your current policy versus what the new policy is proposing. And you will find in reality, there's not a lot of change, but we have a slide if you want to go through that.
Would you like to see that now? Is that,
Oh.
is- yes, I think that was a yes.
Won't live through the night.
I think, we
Yeah,
can-
right, Mike.
I think we can get it done in 5 minutes.
Yes.
Okay,
I'm going to let
I
this
got the
lovely lady
challenge.
carry the brunt of that one for us.
bring it on. Timer.
This is going to be very quick. So regarding the sections of the budget policy, the budget submittal, we kind of already talked about that. The main difference is that the departments are no longer building the additional requests directly into the budget. And then we're trying to identify and make sure that new things are identified. It's just not, we're asking it not to be added into the budget. And we're asking that it be submitted separately. So then the board can decide, once we know what the baseline budget is, where we are at, what things can be funded, and, it can be looked at individually that way. Regarding balanced budget,
Again, we just talked about the balanced budget and the use of reserves. Unless there's further questions on that, that's basically what that is stating. The difference is the current policy refers to that you need to be very careful when you're doing budgets not to exceed and get into the reserves. The new policy is just making it a statement, and that's all the difference is. And again, any of this can be tweaked as we go along to meet the needs of the organization.
regarding the federal and state funded programs, user fees and charges and revenue estimates section. The current policy talks about, it really does encourage the same thing that we're stating here in the new budget, in this budget policy. We're just really restating that to support those best practices.
Again, the consumer price index, we just had a conversation on. If there's questions, I'd be glad to address them. Otherwise, basically, it's the same thought pattern. Yes, ma'am.
Madam Chair Gump.
Yes, Ms. Gumps.
In reference to that horrible, icky, terrible discussion, when do you need that to happen?
Well, we would encourage it sooner than later. I would hope
Like
that.
tomorrow?
I would hope that in the middle of June, the board probably at your July meeting would be because finance would have to vet it. And so if we knew in July, we're not so far along in the process that changes are going to be dramatic as they would be if we learned about it in November. So I would say June would be a good target date. As you will see further on, and I'm not trying to steal Erica's thunder here, but we are doing the same thing with Human Services, asking them to come up with for the non-union employees, if you want to give them an increase in pay, we're asking that the Human Services Committee come up with the suggestion for that and move that on to finance by finances meeting in June. So that we also know what to build for that, because personnel is your largest cost outside of road construction projects to your budget.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Bates, yes. Just
Maybe I'm
detail?
interrupting. Well, it's to the CPI question.
Okay.
So Ms. Juby brought up this concern that we might vote yes on a CPI vote, maybe at our June board meeting, but that when the budget comes on November 1st, let's hope, that somebody might change their mind, something like that. Would a CPI vote be binding in June? That's the done deal, isn't it?
Well, nothing is ever binding. The board always has the opportunity to make changes during the year if you get the support for it. Like anything else, you have to have majority vote, but no, it would not be binding. It's something that we are asking just to make the budget process easier, because until you sit in the desk of your working employee, and I'm not making excuses here, we'll do whatever you direct us to do, but right now your accounting staff is still working extremely hard on getting I called it the CAFR. I guess it's been changed now and it's the AFR. And really, it should have been completed and done by the end of April. We've asked for extensions. I understand why you've lost your executive person, but also you can't, when you have those kind of budget discussions in November, that pulls away from everything getting ready for the audit to go in and adjust your budgets and have people reviewing it to make sure we're still in balance. And so it puts a lot of stress on the staff. And, if I could wave my little magic wand, that is why I think it's so important that those kind of major decisions be made early on, because there's only so many people to do the work unless you wanna, and then there's no place to put the people. And so it's a challenge, and I'm not trying to make excuses, but it is a challenge. And to start behind on your next audit just means you're going to be behind all year on it. And so we're trying to rectify two situations at once.
So a CPI vote in June is not a done deal?
I would hope it would be, but
It's kind of a yes, no answer.
No, and I think it was clarified that it's a high recommendation that was given by the board.
Okay.
But until that budget is actually voted upon, to Ms. Juby's point, that's the final vote of approval.
Yes, no, and maybe.
The levy. The levy, yes. Mr. Williams.
Is new growth part of the property tax extension limitation law?
yes.
Or, okay.
I mean, it doesn't count toward the cap.
And
Would you repeat that question, please?
New growth, new EAV in the county, is that subject to the property tax extension limitation law? The answer is yes.
well, it's the first year it is not, it's outside of the property because it's new property coming on. The next year, then it is limited by the property tax limitation. So I misspoke there and I
New growth after the
apologize.
first year.
You get a pass.
But the different thing this year for your budget also that you have to keep in the back of your mind is right now, the CPI for the 2024 calculation of taxes is 5%. I mean, the state's already published that. That means if you decide to take it, we have to have a truth in taxation hearing because your budget's growing 5% or more. So to then change it in November could cause some issues for us, but because You wouldn't be able to go forward in November because we wouldn't have time to have the truth and taxation hearing. So we just have to be aware that we do have some legal constraints around.
If we go 5 and above, if we go under 5, then
And we're
there's no-
fine.
then we're fine. And I think that's what total budget, yeah, or Mr. Berman.
The total budget has to be over that amount before we have a truth and taxation meeting.
The levy,
Property tax growth.
It's the levy, not the
For the
budget.
property tax,
levy.
not just,
levy.
not just one thing.
All right, 5 minutes is up. Okay, so we'll deal with wage adjusted and merit pool when we talk to the finance committee. We'll complete the conversation.
And I just want you all to know, please, if you have questions, you have both of us here that I know trust is earned. You just don't trust someone off the street. And I'm a person who's off the street coming in to help you. But I think if you were to talk to any of the department heads or elected officials from where I came, that is the one thing they would tell you I exceeded at was trust. And I'm not going to pull any wool over anybody's eyes. I'll be very honest with you. Because again, knowledge is power, and the more knowledge you have and understanding of this whole process, you'll be so much better off and further off than a lot of other boards. And that's my ending. Ta-da.
Thank you, Ralph.
Just to kind of wrap this up too, those two resolutions that are on the agenda are the original resolutions that we presented. So they're moving on to the finance committee agenda tomorrow, along with the same presentation. We're hoping that it can be moved forward as we work through the changes that may need to come and to get this approved and moving forward. So that's why you'll see it that way. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. All right. I think the time is getting close to calling this wonderful meeting to an end. I hope you found it interesting. I don't believe that we have any call for executive session. And with that, sir, Mr. Kenyon.
I'd like to make a motion that we adjourn and face what's left of our day.
Thank you, sir. Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I'll take your cat.
I don't think anybody's opposed.
Just release.